right, guys, what's up? Welcome to Ask Truth Apologetics. I'm here doing something a little bit different today. I'm here with my friend Brian, and he's going to be talking to us a little bit about what's going on at this present time, especially here in America with a lot of the protests and some rioting and stuff like that. And just had a lot of questions that I've been wanting to ask people who would be members of the Black community. Um, what their take is, what their perspective is. So we're not going to be really talking theology or anything like that today. I may go into some theology about what we talk about on some separate videos. But right now, I just think it's really important that we just hear different perspectives, see perspectives from people that aren't exactly the same as we are, and just have a good conversation and kind of learn about other people. So without any further ado, I'll just get started and grill you with about
Perfect.
20 questions.
Perfect.
My first question is, Brian, where did you grow up?
Where did I grow up? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course, man.
Looking forward to this conversation. Just as a forewarning, I'm probably going to have a lot of non-traditional views. So as far as this is concerned, just as a precursor, a little warning to everybody. Yeah. So where did I grow up? So I grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, inner city Indianapolis, in somewhat of a rough neighborhood. If you ask me where I'm from, I think the easiest place, like for me to say, is like 22nd, 23rd in Kenwood, which was in the 90s. Very, very rough place. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
For people who aren't familiar with the city of Indianapolis, is that like comparable to other kind of famous inner city type of places, or
Not necessarily. In some ways, yes. Some ways, no. I mean, Indianapolis didn't really have, like, when you think of like super urban areas, especially for Black people, you think of projects, right? You think of like New York, the projects there, or like Chicago projects, South Side of Chicago. Not necessarily in that same way, right? But the area I grew up in was really rough, right? So I mean, you would hear gunshots. I mean, which was almost like an every other night occurrence, which felt like, right? So saw my one of my good friends' fathers get killed. Saw a guy get shot on my neighbor's car, bleed out and die. That type of stuff, right? So it was a rough environment. Right? Yeah. So
wow. So I didn't even know any of that stuff. That's pretty crazy stuff.
Yeah.
So kind of how old were you when you experienced those types of things?
So probably 10, 9, 10 ish.
Wow. Okay.
Right.
So like developmental years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So like 9 or 10. Interestingly enough, we grew up. We were had kind of like two different upbringings, right? So I grew up, like probably birth to age probably 12. Not necessarily always in poverty, but definitely we were really poor, right? There was a period of time we were like lights off, gas off, water off poor, like wintertime poor, right? Which happened. But then I had like after like age 12, I was my dad and I started a business, and it was became very successful. So it was went from being stupid, dirt poor, having no idea what a vacation was, and never really hearing the concept to going on vacations regularly. And so it was just a little bit of a different life. So you had two sides of the world, right?
That's interesting. So you kind of answered my question there. So did you ever grow up like experiencing racism?
That's an interesting question. So yes and no, right? So growing up, where we did, I mean, we grew up around mostly other Black people. There weren't. I don't think there was a white family in our neighborhood. You never really saw white people in our neighborhood, right? So, and even where my grandparents lived, they lived on Broadway, 25th and Broadway, which when they bought the house, I mean, it was a beautiful area, but slowly ran down. But there was only one white person in that neighborhood, so it was mostly I was around other Black people. But the churches that we went to were all white, right? So I went to an all white church. Then we went to a Korean church for a long time with my dad. It's just kind of
that's awesome,
kind of crazy, right?
Yeah.
Learned Korean as a kid, which is really interesting. Yeah, random. But to be honest, I didn't experience racism until I was probably so it was probably like 8 or 9. The first time I ever really understood what it
Mm-hmm.
was. And we went. My dad went to help. Actually, took us all. So he took my mom and my brothers, 2 brothers.
Okay.
Um, he took us to this family's house on the south side of town, sort of south side, southwest side,
Yeah.
Harding Street area, and we were helping them move.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were doing that, somebody flattened all 4 of our tires. And that was like my first real experience. Like
Okay.
it was an all white neighborhood.
Yeah.
And it was like it was a knowing now and finding out later, like it was just an area where black people weren't supposed to be, right? And so they took the liberty of flattening all 4 of our tires. And for me, that was like a concept I didn't really understand at the time. But yeah, that was like my first encounter.
Okay, so you're helping your whole family's there. You guys are helping this family move. You guys walk back out to the car, and tires are basically sitting on their rims.
Yeah. So they were. Yep.
And so you said you're 8 or 9.
Mm-hmm.
I'm imagining myself as 8 or 9 years old. I'm just gonna be like, why are the tires flat?
Yeah. There was. I think we'd even gotten prepped before we went there. I think my parents actually prepped us like just be careful. One of those things. But I didn't really understand
what that meant.
That meant. But whatever we were my brothers and I were. I would say we were really good kids for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
Like we listened, so if they said something, we were obviously focused in on making sure we did it. But I didn't understand the actual danger until after that happened, and we felt very much so uncomfortable. And it was somewhat of a scary feeling. So.
Okay, so what did you realize what had happened to the car, why it had happened, anything like that, or was it something that you learned, like you came to realize later, or is it something that your parents explained to you?
Once we found out our tires were flattened, it was very apparent what had happened, right?
Okay, so you even at that age,
at that age, you knew something, like, okay, this is not good, right? But it wasn't like my parents, like I would say most of the people that I grew up around, like we didn't even interact a ton with the people in our neighborhood, right?
Okay.
We were in a very impoverished area. My dad had very much so the philosophy, be in it, but not of it, right?
Okay, yeah.
But most of the kids I grew up around, like mainly because of the demographics of Indiana, right? Indiana's like 75-80% white,
right.
10% black roughly. And most of the kids and most friends I grew up with were white, right? So I didn't feel that or experience it in any of those settings to a point where I would have understood. There probably was something that happened, but I'd never really felt it or understood it. But that was probably the first case in which I really understood that it was an uncomfortable feeling, like I wasn't supposed to be in that area, and it was kind of scary a little bit.
Okay, so you felt uncomfortable.
Yeah.
You felt a little bit afraid.
Yeah,
like
especially at like 8,
right? Whoever
my
did
dad's
that
with me, yeah, but yeah,
whoever did that would come after you, perhaps, or whatever. I understand that. The I don't belong here type of feeling. Can you describe that a little bit more? Kind of paint the picture for maybe what that might be like.
Yeah. So the only way, so I know how to explain that, like, so when we were kids, we would, we had far more freedom of movement at like 4 and 5 years old than kids nowadays would ever do.
Right,
so
of course.
A period of time we lived in an area called Brightwood, which is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Brightwood, or the Meadows.
I don't think so.
Yeah. So those areas are super, like, still to this day, like really rough, right? Really rough areas. And I never thought anything about it, right? We would go, there's a place called the 30th Street Market, and we'd go and we'd walk there as kids. Like, so my parents would send us, we'd go to the store, have a list of stuff we get, and then we'd come back and walk. So me and my older brother, and sometimes my younger brother would go with us. But I never once felt like I didn't belong, right? I never experienced what feeling like it didn't belong meant until that day. Like that day, it was like, you don't necessarily belong here.
Yeah. So did you just want to leave?
Oh yeah, I wanted to leave school.
Okay, so you didn't experience any, and maybe you experienced it later, like shock and kind of maybe.
No, I think after that situation was done, there wasn't a lingering feeling. You're a kid, right? As a kid, you don't like a scene changes things for you. You don't really think about it past that, right? And we didn't, right? So it's like, okay, that happened. That was uncomfortable. Wanted to leave. It was, but it was that wasn't my normal. Right,
Okay.
that wasn't the situation I was normal in, so it
Did you
didn't occur
ever
to me.
did you ever feel like did you ever question that? Like why would someone why don't I belong here?
Not really.
Did you feel like you needed to belong there? Did you feel like, well, that's just their neighborhood? I guess this is my neighborhood. Like,
Kind of more like that, right?
okay,
It was kind of like that. But I didn't question it really at all as a
okay,
kid,
yeah,
right? I think as children, you kind of deal with situations as they come, right? And I didn't really think of the long what it meant, like societal wise, right? I wasn't focused on that. Right. I had enough going on in my own personal life
right.
that was not.
There's just kind of one of those things to move on.
Mm-hmm.
Now that feeling of fear that you described and that I don't belong,
Mm-hmm.
those types of feelings they're kind of like smells. I think, like you may forget, you know, this particular place in your life, but then all of a sudden you walk past that smell like grandma or something. All of a sudden you're right back there remembering it.
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if did you ever experience the same feeling again later in life?
Yeah, definitely did.
Okay.
Definitely did. So it was interesting. Like, yeah, definitely felt that same feeling later in life. When I told you like kind of how things changed for us growing up. We would go on vacations, and I think the time when it came back the quickest. Well, there was one other occasion we played local high school around here. My brother was he played at Crispus Attucks. He played football there.
Okay.
We went and played Roncalli, which is on the south side of Indianapolis. And when we went and played Roncalli, it was that same feeling came back.
Really?
It was like, yeah, you don't belong here, right? We were, I'm used to being, even as a kid, I was still used to being around being in a mostly Caucasian area.
Okay.
And not feeling uncomfortable necessarily.
Yeah.
But there was a very uncomfortable feeling. So that was probably the second. It's probably the second time I can really pinpoint like feeling uncomfortable. It's like 11, 12 at that time. And then probably the next time that was really probably significant for me, we were in Florida at a resort down there, and I think we had just gotten in that night, and so we were all walking around. It was a huge resort, all walking around at night, and security followed us basically the entire time.
Okay.
So it was just like,
like your whole family, or just
the whole
your
family.
brothers, or
no,
just everybody?
Like the whole family. So my grandmother's there, my aunt's there, my dad.
So like you notice, like you recognize that, okay,
security's
following us. They're not following anybody else.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
We're gonna end up taking this down, kind of, if there's a systemic issue with it. But before we get there, I just kind of more of a just more of a why question. Why do you think, or even do you think, that racism exists, particularly in this country, but just in general? Like, why do you think that is? How do you think that came about?
So, I probably should have said this before. So, I think people classify racism inappropriately.
Okay.
Right. So I think so even I would say this. I would say that what I experienced, even when I was on Harding Street, I don't classify that as racism at all.
Okay.
Right. I classify that as more of like bigotry, discrimination. Right.
Okay.
But I answer that question the way because most people categorize that as racism.
Right. I think I would as well. But if you can just kind of help clarify the difference.
Yeah. So I don't see that as racism necessarily. So those are, I classify it as a lack of being around. Like, so people have a natural fear of things that they've never done before or that are different. Or if they've got a program thought around, like, think about a roller coaster, right? Okay. Looking at a roller coaster might scare the crap out of you, right? But once you hop on one and have experience with it, you're like, man, that was actually awesome. Right. It was a great experience, right? Right. And I think a lot of times bigotry and discrimination come from really not being exposed to certain people or certain things, right? Yeah. And really buying into the programming buying into how we're programmed through television, right? Okay. And media. And so I think a lot of that is what typically happens, right, with people's interactions. Now, what I see racism is when someone in power prevents you from doing something that you want to be able to do.
Okay.
That for me is like racism, right? It's
Right.
what I call racism. Is literally preventing me from an opportunity that everybody else has, but they're keeping me out of it because
For
of
a
the color of my skin.
specific reason. Yeah.
Yeah. So racism usually involves power.
Okay. So, and I'm going to try to kind of say what you said, but
Yeah.
in a different way and see
Yeah.
if I understand what you're saying. So, I would say that maybe there's systemic racism in terms of there's an actual system in place by people who have the power to write a system for the sheer purpose of holding a person or a people group down because of some reason based around their race or gender or something like that. I guess what you're describing as discrimination or bigotry, I would call individual racism, where it's just like one person has their own individual experience, doesn't necessarily have power, but says, I don't like, I'm afraid of you, or I don't understand the situation, and I'm going to kind of the best offense or the best defense is a good offense. So I'm going to be offensive towards them or whatever it is.
I mean, you try to protect yourself from what you perceive as a threat.
Right.
Right.
Okay. So almost more out of just ignorance, like you were saying. That,
yeah.
Like, they just have. Maybe they had an experience with someone who had a particular skin color, and they just associated that with their experience.
That's possible, but I think most times it's lack of even having those experiences, right?
Okay.
It's really what we if you watch the news, right? The news is like before this whole COVID, and,
right?
Before this whole thing went down. When you turn on the news, what is the first thing you typically see?
Well, they're going to go over like the crimes and
crime is the first thing you see.
Yeah.
And who do you see? Who do they portray committing those crimes?
I mean, generally speaking, it's a
black people,
person of minority. Yeah,
it's person of color, right? It's the first thing you see every time you turn on the news.
Okay.
Every news story seems to be about that, right? Which the strange thing is that blacks and whites commit crimes at the same rate, even violent crimes at the same rate, but we're not portrayed the same ways, right?
Right.
So when you are programmed to see every day that people of color are committing violent crimes every day, so what is your thought process going to be when people are watching the news constantly, and that's the first thing that you get fed,
right?
Programmed from the time
so
that you're young.
You start to have an association with a color and a crime. It's almost like Pavlov's dog, right?
Yeah.
You hear the bell, you salivate, you see this color, and you think crime automatically,
right?
And
right. So it's less on the people who are. So it's less on people making a decision like I'm choosing to be racist, right? It's more on the fact that they're programmed into this, right? Even through school, right? The things that we learned in school programmed it. Like it didn't highlight anything that people of color did. Very rarely, like maybe Benjamin Banneker or George Washington Carver.
Yeah.
Right. But it doesn't highlight that. Right. So you see people of color portrayed as slaves only. Right.
Okay.
And so you don't have there's not a lot of value built into people of color systemically.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So when people act a certain way, why are we surprised? Because that's how you've been trained. Right. That's what you've been exposed to. So for me, it's like I don't fault people that way because the system has been designed so that they'll react a certain way, and people are just doing what they've been designed to do. Right,
and that's like I'm gonna skip past a bunch of the other questions, so that kind of leads me to like, what would your advice be? So let's say that you're someone who's in a place of influence and power, and you have the ability to speak to people who will listen to you. And so let's say the whole nation, so to speak. How would you go about trying to solve those issues? Like, would you try to work through a media outlet? Would you try to, like, what would you say to perhaps change people's perspective? I know it's like a highly intense thing to think about, but I'd be curious.
So here's the interesting thing. So I think the generations that are upon us now, I mean, obviously people know that it's not fair or right to discriminate against someone because of their race, right? But we all do it in every single day, right?
Yeah.
We use the simplest form of what we know about something as far as how we interact with it, right? I don't think we can ever change like the bigotry and the discrimination completely, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the only way that we're able to do that is through positive exposure,
Okay.
right? So allowing people to, like Indiana, like you go to rural, which I travel the country and the
Mm-hmm.
state,
Yeah.
right, for
Yep.
work, and you go to rural communities, and the people are extremely nice. They just most have not interacted with Black people, and
Mm-hmm.
what I hear mostly, which is it's kind of sad and somewhat frustrating. But like, man, you're not what I expected, right? Like,
Yeah. Yeah.
I was like, well, if you were around more Black people, you probably would understand that the image that you get portrayed in the media is completely different than
Mm-hmm.
the average Black person that you're going to meet, right?
Yeah.
Um, we're not that polar, dynamic that
Mm-hmm.
most people see, but I think to change, to make a significant change, that's a loaded question.
I know. I know.
It's a loaded,
Maybe not a fair question.
it's a loaded question. There's just multiple facets that need to be changed,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I was on the crime prevention board for the city county council for 3 years,
Yeah.
right? Which I was really blessed to be a part of. It was a huge opportunity. Um, I'll say that before I talk about that
Mm-hmm.
a little bit more. I think systemically, what we have as far as the issue with mass incarceration, right? We have a justice system that has focused very highly on, or the laws that have come across really can't help but to punish certain people a certain way, right?
Okay.
It's the way the laws are written, right?
Okay.
And so even if you wanted to govern differently,
Mm-hmm.
You basically would be going against the law, right? So it's tough for even judges at this point to make a difference, unless they just chose, to rule separately. But
right, or they would have to go up through the Supreme Court to get a law change.
Right, a law, or just legislation, right? So you have the local lawmakers to make different legislation, and federal lawmakers to make different legislation. So that is one piece, right? So you've got mass incarceration, and the laws are in place. They're criminalizing things that shouldn't be necessarily criminalized, right? We see the big change as far as how opiates are looked at right now, right? So when you had crack in the 80s, you had super stiff penalties for people who were using crack, not just selling, but using. If you had a crack rock on you, some of the laws would put you in prison for life, right? Or just have really stiff penalties that were carried with it. Opiates are not looked like that anymore. Do you know why? Because the population that is on opiates is a different population that was on crack, right?
Okay.
So it's but people are coming to the understanding that those things were wrong and done inappropriately.
So it's almost a reflection of, yes, owning crack is wrong. Having opioids is perhaps wrong, and I know you may have a different opinion, but let's say that everybody agrees those are wrong.
Yeah.
But because the majority of people in charge are Caucasian, and now it looks like almost the majority of people who are on opioids are Caucasian. You might know. I don't know the statistics.
It is, well, the majority of people on crack are actually Caucasian.
Are they really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the numbers game.
Okay.
Right. If we look at percentage wise, it's
percentage wise. That's what I'm talking.
Percentage wise is different. Yeah. Percentage wise.
And so, crime for crime. And this is one statistic I was going to look into is crime for crime. So if you compare a Black person with a white person, they commit the exact same crime.
It's a
let's say their history is the same type of history, right? Like no pre-occurring felonies or anything like that. Generally speaking, the Black person is going to get a much harsher sentence than the white person is.
Absolutely. Mainly because there's a lot that plays into that, but mainly it's because of access to resources, right? So
okay, interesting.
Access to resources is huge. So
So you think it's more? And sorry to interrupt. So do you think it's more of a, for whatever reason, the white people had more? They had just a better lawyer. Is that what you're saying when you say resources? Or they had a lawyer?
They had a lawyer.
So it might not necessarily be that the judges are racist in general, or
no, it's not judges being racist, right? I think it's less that, right? It's hard to when you have to do your job a certain way based on the requirements. I mean, don't get me wrong. There probably are some judges that are racist, right? So, do they discriminate? Definitely. Are they discriminatory? Are some of them bigots? Probably.
Right.
I'm not saying all of them are, but the laws and the way they currently are written make it very difficult for them to do anything other than what they have to do per per what you've done based on your offense, right?
Okay.
So I had a kid that I worked with. I worked in mental health for like 8 years before I got into like medical device sales, and there was a kid I worked with. A gentleman asked me to work with him. He was on the streets for years. He's actually a good kid. He wanted to do the right thing. He just really didn't do a good job of it, right? So he ended up getting into a situation where he did breaking and entering, right? Never been in trouble before, never had any issues before, and I didn't know this, right? I had lost touch with him for a couple of months, and I get a call from the Marion County Jail, and he tells me he's in jail, blah 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 blah, and I'm like, man, I was like, okay, whatever you need, let me try to help you as however I can. Before I could get down there, he took a plea.
Oh, okay.
Took a plea. So basically, like, he didn't harm anyone. He had just broken in and stolen property because he was on the streets, homeless. I'm not saying that obviously what he did was wrong.
Right.
I'm not justifying that at all.
Right.
But a similar Caucasian male in his position would not have taken a plea for 7 years. They tried to throw 15 at him. So.
And he agreed to it?
He agreed to 7 years. He took a plea. And was in
okay,
jail for
because like, we could put you in jail for 15.
For 15, but if you take this plea,
we'll put you in 7.
Yeah.
No lawyer. You can't get there in time.
Nope.
Your hands are tied.
Yeah.
His hands are tied.
Yeah.
Wow. So.
Yeah.
Did he end up spending all 7 years in prison? Or?
Well, because of the fact that, like with states, you only basically spend like a little bit over 60% of your time.
Yeah.
Right? So he did roughly 4.5 years.
Okay. How did he handle that? Coming out, right? So he goes to prison, I assume, right? Not jail, like prison.
No, he went to prison.
Okay, so he goes to prison for probably a crime he shouldn't have gone to prison.
No,
for at least for that long.
There's no chance he should have gone to prison. Period.
But because of him being misrepresented or just made a mistake. How did he come out of that? How did he come out of that? I don't know if you spoke to him or not.
Oh no, we still speak. Yeah, so. So the good thing is he hasn't gone back.
Okay.
Right, which is productive. He wants to stay out. He's trying to do everything he can to do that. He's got kids now and a girlfriend.
Okay.
He hasn't progressed the way that I'd like, but he's still keeping himself. He's trying to be a productive member of society, which is difficult. So this kid was on the streets from basically like age 12.
Oh,
right,
wow. Okay.
almost from age 12. So he didn't have the same, like, he's a very smart, intelligent kid, but he's adapted to the survival mentality, right? And so he could be successful if given the proper situation, right? But in prison, it did not help his ability to do that. You know what I mean? So he came out a much different person than he went in. But he still doesn't want to go back there.
Right.
Obviously.
Do you, I think we're all a product to some degree of the environment that we grew up in. I mean, obviously starting with our family and then kind of moving out to community or, maybe some experiences we've had outside. I always count myself as I say, I'm very blessed because I grew up in a good environment, good family, all that kind of stuff. I just can never understand the experiences that other people have and what leads them to making the decisions that they make. But I can sometimes go into my fantasy world and go, okay, if I was in this situation, would I have behaved differently than them? Right? Could I have behaved differently? Yes, right. I think we all have the choice to behave differently, but would I? And oftentimes I look back at my life and I go, wow, if I had an opportunity to do this bad thing, if I'm being honest, I would have done it. I just didn't have that opportunity.
I think it's less that though, right? It's not. Okay. It's less you having. So for you to be able to be in his shoes, you would have had to gone through the same, or for you to make this similar decisions that he did.
Yeah.
You would have to be throughout his life into the same circumstances, situations that he was in, right? Which led to him making that decision, right? I, one thing I didn't say, I ended up in foster care at one point and ended up aging out, right? So, I was blessed to have a strong foundation very early on, right? So I had two phenomenal parents
Mm-hmm.
who taught me a lot. You
Yeah.
know, and so when I did go into foster care, like, before I went to foster care, I was on the streets for like 6 months. Right.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. Long story. Right. Even hearing.
How old were you at that point?
Like 15.
Okay, I won't ask you a million.
No, no,
I
no.
just
You're
want to
fine.
know
You're fine.
age
Yeah,
wise,
yeah,
just so
yeah. I
I
was
can
like
kind of
15.
get
Right.
a gauge
Yeah.
of it.
So
Okay.
my younger brother and I literally like gone for 6 months. So, um, but yeah. So it was, so I was in a better position than him to be able to make better decisions.
So you're just saying because of your foundation.
Yeah,
because of that foundation.
Yeah, because having a stronger foundation does lead to, especially earlier on,
mm-hmm.
does lead to better decision making.
Right. Because I mean, a lot of people would be out like you were when you're 15, 16 years old. I would say what are the statistics of someone going out on their own 15, 16 and not experiencing super duper poverty later in life or crime or something like that.
It's low.
Yeah.
Right? It's low.
And so that was what I really wanted to, one of the main things I wanted to focus on was, and you kind of hinted at it, but I want to know if you could expound any further. What's the difference? Like, why did you choose, like, I'm sure you had opportunities to go this way, but you went this way instead.
I truly bring it back to foundational, what I learned very, very early, right? So my parents were I grew up in a super conservative Christian household.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so they were very regimented with us as far as what we did not do, what we were exposed to.
Yeah.
And I always had that mindset of in and of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Kind of regardless. My parents aren't perfect,
right.
Neither of them are, but they're, I've got solid relationships with both of them today. But it was that upbringing of what they taught me that was able to really guide me through the difficult situations that we did. And and trust me, I made poor decisions along the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I definitely did. But I was blessed that the foundation I was given, I was able to make better decisions than most.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Right. And you could recognize perhaps your bad decisions and move.
Yeah. And they weren't damaging, right? They weren't long lasting damaging.
Yeah.
So, but I think the one thing that's tough is, especially with kids who don't necessarily, have never had that guidance.
Right. Like they start out in chaos, right? They start out in chaos and then they go out into chaos. And then, those are some challenging things that I can't imagine being able to overcome.
It's hard. It definitely is. It's not impossible, but it's definitely hard. When I was in foster care, I had a chance to, I thought I had it rough, right? Which is hilarious. But you see far worse cases, right? I knew a kid who was, his foster parents kept him locked in a shed. They fed him like a dog. Yeah. And then there was a gal who ended up knowing she was basically raped every day by her foster father, right?
Yeah.
And it was just one of those things that you're like, man.
And none of those things were their decision, right?
No.
Obviously.
No.
Do you know how they handle that? How they manage it? If
they
were able to move on?
They were surprisingly able to move on.
That's
shockingly.
Awesome.
I mean, and be very productive citizens.
Yeah.
Right.
Why do you think that is? Do you think they were just wired that way? Do you think they had a good solid start to their life, or?
I mean, some of these kids. One kid, the kid who was basically locked in a shed, he didn't know anything other than foster care, right? Basically from the beginning of his life. And the truth is, I don't know, right? I don't know, right? For me, I know this. I do know that difficulty shapes you.
Yeah.
Right? Difficulty shapes you, and it helps you to become a better person, right? Mm-hmm. If you're able to push past and not be crushed by it.
Right. But some people I found lean into their difficulty.
Some do. And I don't know what...
As the Bible verse goes, a dog returns to its vomit, right?
Yeah,
so does a fool return to his folly. So some people, they do something and they go, oh, that was terrible. Let me try to do it again and not have it be terrible. Let me try to do that again and again. And it's almost like they're getting into this cycle. And I'd love to hear your perspective on it.
I think we all do that.
Yeah,
in certain ways, right? We all have negative habits that we keep coming back to, right? I think a lot of it is learned behavior for some people,
right?
It's what they've known their entire life, so it's really hard to get away. But for others, it's I don't know what may drive that. Some of it may not be learned for those individuals. But in the course of trying to survive for a lot of people, I think it's tough for people to, what you would think is a quality decision is completely different when you're in a situation when you have nothing.
Yeah.
Right. When you have nothing, like you, and you don't have any hope for the future, right? Your decision making is just completely different. And
right.
they say that wealthy people think about life as far as, and decision making as far as like, okay, this decision, okay, how long is this? Like, they think about 5 years in the future,
okay,
how it's going to affect them.
Right.
Most people who are in poverty, extreme poverty, think about, okay, this decision I'm making, how does that affect me 2 hours from now?
Right, and that's just the Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Exactly, right. So you have so much going on that you have a very difficult time thinking about how it truly affects what's going to happen to you later.
Right. I mean, if you're starving to death, you're not thinking about.
And most of it's not starving to death,
right?
Right.
I mean, like, I'm just using that. Like,
no, absolutely. No, you're 100% right.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm not going to keep you here all day. I would like to ask you about more current events.
Okay.
I just wanted to get a little bit of an understanding of kind of where you yourself have come through. And of course, I know you personally. These people don't know you. But, you know, I've learned a few things about you from your past and your childhood, which makes me applaud you all the more for what you've been able to do and what you've been able to build. It is and it isn't, as you know. I think some things are, you know, happenstance, chance, perhaps, and other things. You know, some people can kind of self do it, and you had a good foundation and whatnot. And I think it's interesting because you've had a lot of unique perspectives. So you've gone through. You had a good foundation to kind of start with. You know, didn't grow up necessarily knowing if you were poor or not poor. Like maybe you just thought it was.
No, I knew I was poor.
Okay.
I did,
but apparently didn't affect you too much.
No.
And what's interesting is I don't think you ever took on that identity.
No, and I think that was the environment that I was raised in.
Okay.
Right? You know, I think poor sometimes is a mindset more than anything. You have to, like, my parents, even myself from an early age, like I always knew I was meant to do more. I can't really describe it other than that, right? And they always told me I was meant for more, right? So that's basically the closest thing. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they always gave me hope for the future, right?
Yeah.
And they told me I could do whatever I wanted.
And you believed it.
No, I did.
Which is great.
You know, it's funny. I at like 6 or 7. So I have vitiligo, right? Which is, you can see right here, right?
Yeah.
Which is a autoimmune skin condition, right? And so part of that is like the hair that grows out of that is like white or gray, right? And so I would have little patches of gray in my hair.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so my dad and mom, from a very early age, they told me that gray hair meant wisdom. Right. And I was wise and smarter than everybody. And I literally believe it.
And you believe it. That's great. Yeah.
It's amazing what you can program into your kids, right? And so I went around, like, literally, I mean, I probably acted that way too, but I thought that, right? And it's amazing kind of the small things that you can do to empower. But the basis and the foundation I had gave me the ability not to be hopeless, even in the most difficult of times. You know, so I went through physical abuse in my own home, which is pretty traditional in Black community for the most part, right? Yeah. There's a lot of physical abuse that happens. It's kind of comes down from slavery times, you know. As far as that's concerned, and so I went through a lot of physical abuse, and for me, like, regardless of what happened, you know, I always knew that I was meant to do more, right? And that, for me, kept me out of worrying about what was happening right now. I was able to be happy, and that being I think the one crucial thing is being able to remain happy. And that was probably the biggest difference with all the kids. So I worked with foster care youth for years. Yeah. The biggest difference for them was that happiness. You know, so the ones that were happy usually tended to be the ones that were able to be more successful.
There's about 1,000. We need to do another thing. I would love to talk about happiness and how that influences things, but just for time purposes.
I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I think it's a really good topic for us to think about. You know, moving forward, and for you know, those watching us to move forward as well.
Yeah.
But you know, you've become success. I hate the word success because it's like, what is that?
Success is a
usually,
journey.
Usually for most people, when they hear successful, it just means like you have enough money to own a house and a car,
Yeah,
and you can think about the future 5 years ahead.
right, right.
But it's so much more than that. But I'm just gonna focus a little bit on that. So
Yeah.
so you started out in life where I would say not successful, um, being in a foster home,
Mm-hmm.
and dealing with all those kinds of things. Not not a really good environment necessarily for predicting that you would become a successful
It's not a good,
person.
it's not a good
So if,
predictor of
if we're just
success.
going just based on if I'm gambling, if I'm in Las Vegas, probably not going to take those odds,
No, true.
right?
Yeah.
That it's going to turn out. But you've so far, I know you can mess up later, but so far you've turned out amazingly well,
Mm-hmm.
and you've become successful. And kind of part of the things I wanted to illustrate, which you've hit on, is what's the difference
Mm-hmm.
between those two things, and why. So we don't have to hit on that too much more. But kind of the meat of the matter is, do you think that the protests that are happening now, do you think that they're beneficial? What do you think their goals are? And do you think that the goals of that protest are good goals? Are those the goals that you yourself would encourage other Americans to have?
Hmm. That is a very interesting question. um, hmm. Never shy on opinions, so um, this will probably be a little controversial,
Okay.
right? So, um, hmm. Yeah. So the protest, which is interesting to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the entire environment of what we're in right now for the last, actually, really, it's June, 6 months
Mm-hmm.
roughly,
Yeah.
5 months or so, 5 months in a week.
Mm-hmm.
2020 has been very interesting from the standpoint that we've had a lot of things. We previously before had a lot of things that were introduced in our lives to induce somewhat of panic or chaos,
Mm-hmm.
right? This has been a record year for how that has been manifested in people's lives, right? Through news media,
Mm-hmm.
right? I think it's interesting. I believe the beginning of the year was all about impeachment, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when that went away, it was Corona, and then
Right.
when Corona started dying down, what is the next thing we see? Panic and chaos in the streets around Black Lives Matter and all that, So around racism,
Mm-hmm.
but it's interesting what is chosen to be put in front of you at the time
Mm-hmm.
as something to get upset about. The interesting thing is, I feel like we've had a narrative that's been kind of put in front of us for everybody to buy into,
Mm-hmm.
right? That causes a little bit of panic and hysteria. And we've all been kind of, I don't know, fed somewhat of a line. And I don't really love what's going on around that, right? So obviously you want to do everything like with COVID, or
Mm-hmm.
let's say the impeachment first, right? That was a huge
Okay.
topic of
Okay.
discussion.
Yeah.
It was super, you know, very polarizing,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so we lived and breathed that for a while. And then when COVID came, it was interesting to see what actually took place as far as the decisions that were made, right? You want to, I spend a lot of time in hospitals.
Yeah.
Around the country in ICUs,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
the interesting thing is that a lot of the patient populations that we work with, the most critical patients have ARDS, which
Mm-hmm.
COVID causes, right? Or a complication of COVID would cause, right?
Okay, you said ARDS.
ARDS, yes. Sorry,
I don't know that. Maybe you guys know that.
Sorry, they've
Yeah.
been talking about ARDS a lot
Mm-hmm.
in the news. So it's acute respiratory distress
Oh,
syndrome.
gotcha. Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically when you develop fluid on your lungs,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Like a
Secretions,
pneumonia type of thing.
Getting a calcification in the lungs. Basically, it's a bad deal,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's a 50% mortality rate when you do develop something like that.
Okay.
Yeah. So you like VAP or ARDS, one of the two. Like
Mm-hmm.
once that's developed, it's a bad deal. So, you want to make sure that you're doing the proper things, right? You want to make sure that patient is being mobilized. You want to make sure that you're doing proning. You want to get
Mm-hmm.
the secretions out of the lungs. You want to make sure that patient is up and moving. It's so critical, right? It's super critical for mobility to continue to happen.
If you get stagnant, that's over.
Literally.
So you just need to keep things moving.
Yeah. So every system in the body is negatively impacted,
Mm-hmm.
right, by immobility. You see a patient when you go, if anyone's ever been to the ICU, most of those patients never get up and walk.
Right.
Like ever. Right. But there's
up to everything.
Yeah, there's a ton of research. They understand, like hospitals understand, but they just don't have a really good way to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, like like having been in this environment every year, you see a ton of flu patients every year come in that will develop ARDS or, and you know that it's a possibility that this will happen to a specific population. Usually there's comorbidities at play, with these populations. And it was interesting to watch the news show, like, oh, we have a lack of ventilators, we have a lack of beds, have all this stuff, huge panic, And it's like, I'm in those environments. They don't have a lack of that, right? There's not a lack of ventilators, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
There's only a small percentage of the population who would get critical enough on COVID to actually be put on a ventilator. Okay. And that's like a last ditch effort. Like you don't even want to do that. You want to prone first. There's a lot of other stuff you want to do. And you're seeing this pushed into the media, but like I get to talk to my friends that are medical directors in hospitals all the time, friends that are, let's say, that are medical directors for health insurance companies, and very top level individuals. They're like, well, hospitals have never been more empty. ICUs are empty.
Right. So these are people
that I know.
There's no reason for them to.
They're not making it up. Right. So, other states experienced it a little bit more.
Like New York type of stuff.
New York, yeah. But the interesting thing is that, and New York surprisingly does have a lot of beds, right? I spent a lot of time in New York working at hospitals there, in the ICU at New York Presbyterian and other places.
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is that I felt like there was an agenda being pushed with that, right? Okay. Very strongly causing panic and hysteria, right? The one thing you saw on CNN was basically a death count every day. Let's focus on the most negative possible, circumstances. And for me, it's like, okay, what do we need to do to protect everyone as best as we can?
Right.
How do we? I think we could have gone to like masks and gloves earlier instead of shutting down the entire economy, which for me was didn't make any sense. But I understand when there's something that you don't really understand why you want to take the proper precautions. I just don't feel like that was the best thing that we could have done. There could have been other decisions made, but they acted with the information that they had.
Right. In hindsight's.
Right. Hindsight's 2020. Yeah. Right. We're looking at it now like, I probably should have done that. Right. Could have done some other things, but it just felt like there was an agenda there. And as COVID started to ease, right, the restrictions around that, what is the next thing that we see constantly in our face, right? Right. We see the killing of George Floyd, which is awful, right? For me, it is super upsetting, as a black male. You relate to that. I've been pulled over a ton of times. I haven't been like physically abused by the police. My brother has, was yanked out of a car one time. It was, just crazy, unnecessarily, and so, the one thing I was taught as a kid, my dad always was like, hey, you want to be as respectful as possible. Your job in that interaction is to get out alive, right? And so you want to make sure that you are, you're not causing them. And I'm a big black dude, 6'3", 220, right? And so I don't want to make anybody unnecessarily afraid of me, right? So you do the things that you need to, you lighten your voice and do things like that, right? The protests of what's going on right now, to answer your question, I know I'm in a lot of places with
that. I'm sure it'll all come together.
It does, yes. You eventually get back. So the protests and the way that they're going on right now, I truly don't know how we make anything different with them.
Okay.
And maybe I'm sure there's a way that people are thinking about that can possibly change can happen from this, right? I don't see that protest is one of those ways. And I definitely want people's voices to be heard. And it's interesting to see people come together on this, right? I had a buddy, my best friend, call me the other day, and we're really good friends, been good friends with him since we were for like 10, 12 years, right? And he asked me how I felt about everything. And it was interesting because we don't talk about that. And he's white, right? And he's like, he doesn't, but we usually never had those conversations. It was interesting to see that. But so I feel like what this is causing is people to have different conversations about it. And it's pointing out some of the disparities that have been there. But 3 weeks from now, I don't know if anything will change.
Yeah.
Right. So we can, obviously, the looting and the rioting, I feel like is kind of a little bit of a false flag in a sense. I think there are some bad actors at play, and this, you can see from the data, right? The people that are being arrested are not from the states that are, the cities that this is happening in.
Yeah.
People that are actually doing this stuff. It's not people from the city, right?
Right.
It's almost a secondary agenda. Like there's, I can show you videos of bricks being dropped off in metropolitan areas, even in Indianapolis, right? Pallets of bricks, right? Which doesn't make any sense to me, right? And materials to build fires with, right? So it seems it's very interesting, very odd that a lot of that is happening. And that the attention the media is actually giving to it is really interesting, because normally this has not been a huge topic of discussion, right? And I don't necessarily love the way that it's being posed. Like, if you don't say that you're for the Black Lives Matter movement, then now you're a bad actor, or you're a part of the problem. That's not it, right? It's not people openly confessing that Black Lives Matter, which it's nothing to do with it. You actually have to make systemic change, right? And maybe that will happen with some of the things that are going on, with attention being brought to it. I have a hard time believing that
it could, like, so you were mentioning earlier, legislation.
Legislation is a huge key piece to things changing, but more than anything, there has to be a shift in wealth, right? Okay. There has to be a shift in wealth, right? So I think welfare for the Black community has been one of the biggest inhibitors to our success as a people. Okay. Right. So welfare was enacted back in the 60s or whatever, and what it did, it keeps you in a specific place, right? If you need help, financial help, and the government is going to give you that, keeps you in a specific place. If you want to get out of that, right? If you want to make enough money to get out of that gap is so big that if you decide to take on a job, it's going to risk your benefits, right? Okay. Yeah. If you want to, it's too large for the typical person, unless they are building a business of their own, to be able to bridge that gap. Okay. Right. So you have a lot of people staying in poverty, right? Because of that, and relying on the government very heavily, and it doesn't give you the chance and opportunity to reach for other things, which I think was specifically designed that way. Okay. Right.
Now, do you think that it's upheld? Do you think it's a conscious decision now for the powers that be to uphold that?
That's an interesting question. That I don't know. Okay. Right. I know that the way that it was originally designed very much so seems like it was done in a way to keep people in that. And I think it was. Right. It was designed to keep people. I think it was. I think so. I think now, if you look at, not to get too political, but I feel like the Democratic Party focuses on using that as a way to retain voting status. We're going to give you more entitlement programs, right? We're going to do more of that, as opposed to, God, help people build a business and get freedom from the system, right? Right. I think if you can help a person build wealth, right? Especially like Black people don't necessarily. One thing we're really not great at is building wealth through like insurance, right? Okay. When a Black person dies, like their family inherits the debt to put on their funeral and all the other things that go with it, right? So as a community, we've not been really great about that. And one thing the white community, the Jewish community, a lot of the Asian communities have done really well is been able to get together, pass that knowledge on from one generation to another on how to do that, and have insurance policies and have money go from one generation to the other. Okay, yeah. We've not done that very well at all. And so we've really relied on the government through welfare programs to basically exist. Right, and not to grow. There are a lot of Black people that have been able to get out of that, but it's not the overwhelming percentage, right? So we still have a lot of people that are very dependent on that, and the gap for them to be able to get to that next level is really, really high. And so I think we need to focus and really empower people of color to start businesses, just like we empower people from other countries to start businesses, right? The government grants available for those individuals.
So when you say empower, you don't necessarily mean like, you can do it, high five.
No, I mean financially.
You mean financially give, pour some money into that. Okay.
Yeah, gotcha. Absolutely. So I think that is what changes systemically, because once you start creating a wealthier, more educated population, you can actually do more with that from a like a voting standpoint, or let's say we can use our dollars to a specific effect, right?
Okay.
We can support people who choose to push our issues forward, right?
Right.
And we can not support people who don't necessarily have our best interest in mind.
Okay. So, kind of leads me back to the same question I asked. Do you think the government wants to help black people?
Well, the government is people, right?
Well, right.
Right.
And the people in power, and you kind of brought up the Democratic Party. Like, do you think you said they want to keep like enabling people to stay in one location and not to jump that gap? Or and maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying.
I think their mentality has been that, yes.
Because the narrative that I understand is they want equality for everyone, man, woman, child, transgender, whatever, whatever race, whatever color. That the Democratic, the liberals want almost homogeny, right? They want everything to just kind of mix together and everybody have equal opportunity, equal everything. I'm not necessarily saying communism, but perhaps communism,
socialism, possibly,
Bernie Sanders. But my point is it appears to me, and I'm not very political, but it appears to me that that's just kind of the narrative that they're putting out there to think like we're going to help.
The problem
everyone. But do you think
they try to play it like it is help?
But is it?
It's not help.
Why? And so then I want to go to motive. Why would they do that?
That I don't know. Right.
Okay.
I don't know the motive. I can assume what the motive would have been. I mean, there's a great book called The New Jim Crow.
Okay.
And it tells a lot of that story around mass incarceration and the thought process behind some of the political agendas that have happened over the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years.
Yeah.
And it alludes to a lot of, it lets you make your own assumptions, but it paints a very strong picture as far as what's happened in that regard. Yeah. And I would lead your viewers to look at that book.
Okay.
Without me making any suggestions about that. But when you ask, does government want to make a difference, right? So I would say, I think some people in government do want to make a difference.
Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
I don't know. The government itself is not doesn't care one way or another. Now, the laws that are in place would say a certain thing, right? Right, would project a specific narrative. I think those things can be changed by putting people in power that actually care about growth and people being able to achieve the most out of life, right?
Yeah.
And being able to change some of the disparities, of how things are today. Some of the disparities that are in place. But I don't think government technically cares one way or another. It's putting people in the places to make that happen. And I don't feel that the people that are in place right now, not all of those people, want that to change or they're not incentivized for it to change.
Right.
So we talk of mass incarceration. We talk, there are people that benefit by that.
Okay.
Private, prisons and things of that nature.
And so the protests now are around police brutality, it seems. And it sounds to me like you're saying that we as a people, as American people, we have the ability to change legislation through actively going out and voting and informing ourselves about who's going to represent us right and whatnot. Is defunding the police the best place to start with that? I know that's one of the goals and the agendas, and I've not looked into it. I don't know if you have too. I have no problem like defunding the police if there's something better in place after that. I don't imagine there would be a good thing after that, but my point with that is just to ask, what can I do? What can you do? What can viewers do? What can people do to bring about the change that needs to occur, right? Because you kind of said that there just needs to be an empowerment.
When I say empowerment, I mean money. Right?
Yes,
there needs to be there needs to be an influx of money that
I'm going to say what maybe a super conservative person would say.
Okay.
But you can't just, if you give them money, they're just going to sit there with it, right? If it's like giving a man a fish, right, for a day, teach a man to fish. So is the money going directly to the individual, or is it going into a system that helps empower that individual to become more intelligent, know how to invest their money, get better jobs, whatever types of skills, so that they can help themselves? Or do you actually think that just putting money into the individual person is going to make a difference?
Well, I'm glad you clarified that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you, because I don't want to misconstrue my thought process on that.
Mm-hmm.
When I say money, I really mean government grants to help people start businesses, right? So
Okay.
like 100 years
Yeah.
ago, okay, 100 years ago, like 90%, let's say 120 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
90% of the population worked for themselves and 10% worked for corporations.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right now, we have the reverse, right?
Right.
Where we have about 10% of the population working for
Mm-hmm.
themselves, about 90% working for corporations.
Yeah.
Um, so I believe if we're able to get back to an environment in which more people own businesses,
Mm-hmm.
getting away from more of a corporate controlled
Yeah.
economy where it's more based on small business, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think we can be successful. Not that I hate big business or hate corporations. Like I love Amazon, I love Apple,
Right.
I love all these companies.
You have to.
I mean, you do in a
just have
sense.
to do
They
it,
make
yeah.
great products, right?
Right,
I love
exactly.
any company that makes a great product.
Mm-hmm.
And it is like, but we as a society,
Mm-hmm.
like, would benefit more. And I think about Black people as a whole, right?
Mm-hmm.
We
Yeah.
would benefit more by having more ownership in what we do, right?
Okay.
I think it's possible, right? I think if we fund it correctly, we can incentivize things.
Okay.
Incentivize, like, there need to be, it's to get a loan or to get a investment in your business is
Mm-hmm.
like super hard.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy thing to do,
Right.
right? And to be able to be bankable,
Mm-hmm.
for most Black people is a challenge, a serious challenge, because we don't have the typical things set up to be able to, the typical systems to be able to help us with that, right? We don't typically have like a parent that can, co-sign for us,
Right. Okay.
for a $200,000 loan,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. Or we don't have, typically getting credit built up in our own name initially is, in most, I didn't really understand what credit was, right?
Right.
When I was aging out of foster care, I had no idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we don't have those resources to fall back on a lot of times, like other communities, the Jewish community, the white community, the Asian community, have, right, in higher rates than we do. So it's really just educating and providing an environment for those individuals to be successful. But I think the biggest gap to that is the financial piece and being able to have the money necessary to build a business.
Okay. So so I think protesting is great. Defunding police, not necessarily what you would say is the best next step.
Yeah. So defunding the police,
but
I mean,
using the protest to bring about awareness to. I'm a root cause thinker, and I think you are as well. What's the root cause of this? So we talked about quite a few things. We talked about perhaps there's bigotry, just not knowing people of different cultures and colors and those types of things. So bringing in the
I think
the media narrative of that, I think is a big deal. So should the protest be more geared towards that, or if you were in charge, which kind of brings me back around to my weird question, if you were in charge, would you say, look guys, we need to protest, maybe not the media, but we need to talk about different media platforms where, and we have that to a degree, but I think it's also somewhat kind of governed as well, but to where an actual voice can be heard, and we can protest towards change that would actually make a difference.
It's a good question. So defunding the police, I don't think we need to defund the police. I think we need to demilitarize them.
Okay.
Right. So there has been an active incentive from the federal government for different public safety organizations around the country they get funds to buy a very militarized.
Yeah, I remember that. Well, that was probably 8 years ago, maybe, when they started talking about that, and that was under the Obama administration, right?
Even prior.
Was it prior to that?
Even prior to that, right? So, but yes,
they were getting like not tanks, but like these like huge, like with like AK-47s.
No, absolutely, right?
Stuff.
So so they've been very militarized, and that I feel like that culture. So my uncle, who passed away recently, was a police officer, is a sheriff, and worked for another township. And I so with any job, you're always going to have hiring is the most difficult process, right? Building a culture within an organization is difficult. I think the culture, even around public safety and police departments, has been difficult for them to control. I mean, most cops that I know, I love.
Yeah.
Right. Most cops that I know, I love. You know, you run into cops that are jerks. I mean, you find that in any profession, right? I think the culture in which they've come up, you know, you have to think you have different generations interacting, and people program the people coming in based on what they've experienced, right? So the culture that's been created for them may not always been the most environmentally or most friendly for being producing a positive outcome when they interact with the community, right? You know, so I think we have to change the culture. It's really the type of people that we hire for those positions, right? You know, I think if we paid more, we'd get better people, right? And first, I think police definitely should get paid more, right? But I think we need to demilitarize them, and we need more people of color in them. But you know, it still doesn't necessarily change I mean, culturally they need to change, right? I don't think we need to defund them. I think we put more money there. I think we are very strategic about how we choose how public safety interacts. I think someone suggested, and I thought this was actually relatively clever, that the people that actually pull you over for tickets is like a different department, right? So driving infractions is a different department, right? And it's not a criminal department. Like when you're getting pulled over for a ticket and somebody writes you a ticket, it's not somebody that's going to take you to jail, right?
Right. But what if you have a warrant? What if you're fleeing a crime scene?
That person is only there. Like
so you have police on the road who still do that, like
who focus on that.
But then there's another person
another that's focused on driving infractions.
Okay, I understand what you're saying now.
So, So demilitarizing or taking that role away, so that your interaction and thought of that is not I'm going to jail. It's like I'm getting a ticket for something I did. It's a driving.
Almost just kind of like a security guard type of thing.
Yeah,
like they don't really have the authority to arrest you. They can call someone with that authority, but they're not.
So you have a different department or a different area that's focused on criminal activity.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, it is, right? You know, so it would allow you to have a better thought process of the police, you know, possibly, right? Instead of, you know, I may get shot, you know, getting pulled over for a random, you know, random traffic incident. You know, I don't know what can be done to change things from that standpoint. There definitely need to be better interactions. I wish I knew what that was. I can't say anything other than maybe change the culture of those departments and how they interface with the public. But yeah,
I mean, you do see, again, this is all media driven, but I see on the media a lot of times, like, you know, it's like it could be just purely propaganda, but like, hey, they went in this community and, you know, bought this family a pizza or whatever and played basketball and did all those things, which I'm sure occurs. Yeah. I don't know, but
no, it definitely does. When I was in foster care,
right?
I was in a place called the Guardian Home, which is basically a locked facility for kids without placements. So for like 6 months, and the police would come up and play basketball with us, right?
Yeah,
we love that. Right?
Awesome.
It was great.
Cool. Yeah,
it's great.
Okay.
Yeah. So you do have those interactions, right? And I know a lot of great policemen, right? It's the nature of the job is difficult. I think we just need to program people to be kind, right? Yeah. But when you're in a life or death situation, and here's the problem we have now, right? So we talked about what gets programmed into our minds, right? So you see and almost visualize people of color as bad actors in a sense, based on what we see from the news, right?
Yeah.
The first thing you see is some black person killing somebody, you know, blah blah blah. So that's what's painted into
right. And that was one of the things I actually heard today. I tried to watch a conservative news outlet talk about it, and I tried to watch a liberal news outlet talk about it. And a lot of times the conservative news outlets will say things. They both say weird things, but,
very different.
But the conservatives will say, I call it the tu quoque fallacy. Have you heard that before? It's basically saying, like, I know you are, but what am I? It's like, well, you did this bad thing. Well, you also did this bad thing. So who are you to say?
It's very tit for tat. Yeah. It's very tit for tat.
You know, so they were talking about police brutality, and then they were saying how, 84 people were shot in Chicago over a 48-hour period of time. And it was black people shooting black people.
Yeah.
and they're saying, is that the police's problem and blah blah blah. You know, whereas
That's an opportunity problem.
yeah,
That's an
those
that's a
people
whole.
just don't have an opportunity.
Let's say that is there are things the way Chicago is the way it is because opportunity was taken out almost intentionally by the way the highway system was created, right? So a lot of businesses that
Okay, yeah,
yeah they basically you you were able previously to go into the south side and frequent businesses, but when like the highway system was
how
created,
we just like
bypass that whole thing. So
yeah.
you had like a lot of businesses like basically die, and a
Mm.
lot of opportunity was taken. But I mean, there's other things that go into that.
Yeah,
But Chicago is just a different animal, just period, right? But you know, yeah, some you're gonna have like we have a if you interesting thing like if you legalized all drugs, right, doesn't mean that you're gonna get rid of all crime, right? But you would have a lot of you would not have the level of crime that you have, right? I feel like there's a benefit, like they gain a benefit by having this level of crime around
now,
drugs.
is there an association between drug users and violent crimes committed?
That I don't know. I can't.
Yeah.
I can't remember. We did get data around that,
Okay,
right? So
and that would be the only. If I were to make a counter argument, I would say, look, maybe it's the drugs themselves that aren't the issue, but it's the likelihood of someone on drugs committing a violent crime or a robbery or something like that. This is that correlation high enough to warrant saying, well, get the drug user off the street because you know.
I don't know what that. I don't know what that correlation is. It would be interesting to see that data.
Yeah,
it would be very interesting. You know what's really interesting though? What I found out, and this is, 60%. There was a study done. It found out that 60% of people who were incarcerated had suffered a TBI or a traumatic brain injury.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
It's very interesting.
Well, and that goes along with a lot of the research being done, like in the NFL and concussion syndrome.
But it's very interesting
like
though.
Yeah.
Think about that, right? 60% of the population, when they invert, like when you look at the typical population, it's not nearly that high for people to have traumatic brain injuries, but it means that their brains.
Well, if it damages like your prefrontal cortex, your impulse control goes down.
Right. Exactly.
Right? That's where a lot of the TBIs I think are coming from.
But a TBI can be caused by a lot of different things, right? Concussion could be one of them, right?
Yeah.
Very simple way, but I thought that was interesting data. But yeah, I don't. I wish I had better answers for it, Austin. I don't, you know. But one thing I'm committed to do is one of my key functions is to try to create opportunity for others to be able to build their own businesses and to be successful, right? I help whenever I can to be able to do that, right? Whether white or black, but specifically, I definitely try to make an emphasis to do it when I find other black people that are willing to try to make that jump, right?
Right, and it's easier to identify because you were perhaps in their shoes.
Absolutely. But yeah, I think that's the biggest change that we need to make as a culture, like creating more opportunities for people to be successful and to limit or to eliminate the gap that's there from people that want to make a change to being able to the huge financial gap that's there that keeps them from making that change, right? So I think entrepreneurship and really helps that,
and more loans to business owners and
stuff
like that.
Loans, grants, right? Whatever we can do to encourage that. I mean, we do that. Maybe even tax credits, but tax credits don't necessarily help you start, right?
Okay, yeah,
it doesn't help you start, but I think loans and grants definitely do.
All right, perfect, buddy. Well, I could probably talk to you all day.
I know,
but got some busy stuff coming up for myself. But
no, you're good.
Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, my friend.
Yeah.
I'd like to have you on again and just kind of maybe I'll rewatch this video and see if anybody has any questions. So nothing too important. He just said good vibes and live stream location. We're in my house. that's about as much as I want to give away. So yeah, but I'd love to come back and have a few more discussions with you. I've actually been arguing with a friend of mine, so to speak, on the internet about Mithras and the cult of Mithras, and he thinks that Jesus was a myth based on the pagan god Mithras, and so I've done a whole series on it, which I'll have to let you know.
Yeah,
I've got it mostly set up. So he's on your team, by the way, in terms of the Jesus myth types of stuff. Yeah. But it would be fun to sit down and have a conversation.
It would be interesting to see that,
because we'll have a civil discussion. This other individual we don't typically have very very civil discussions about it. And you'll be blown away by some of the data that
yeah, I'd love to see
the
it.
research that I
Love to see
came
it.
up with. So that's a
You
little
should
teaser
also
for you guys.
you
Yeah,
should also do a conversation on astrology.
yeah, no, for sure.
You should do a big conversation. Like, that would be very interesting in how that plays into Christianity, because Christianity talks a ton about astrology. It's very, very interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
So, all right. So we'll have fun with that next time.
Yeah.
But thank you, sir.
No, thank you. I appreciate you bringing me on. This
absolutely.
was awesome.
I think it's.
Sorry,
it's
I was
great.
long-winded, but
We love it.
yeah.
All right. Peace out, guys.